Hi, everyone. So what I'm going to be announcing leads right into our featured speaker. I'm going to be talking first about the days of action coming up in New York City surrounding the UN Sustainable Development Summit. Okay, so moving ahead into the events coming up, as I said, there will be a week. There are days of action surrounding the UN Sustainable Development Summit, as we'll be hearing from our featured speaker tonight. That summit is not all it's cracked up to be. Rather than promoting a genuine agenda of sustainable development, many people feel that in fact it is providing cover for the expansion of the neoliberal agenda, and is in fact a Trojan horse for rotten trade deals like TPP.
Thank you very, very much, Adam. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, I want to introduce our very special guest tonight, Mr. Paul L. Quintos. He is the program manager at IBON International, which is an international non-governmental organization that promotes new development thinking for economic and social justice through capacity development using people's movements around the world. Before joining IBON, Mr. Quintos was an organizer and educator in the progressive labor movement in Philippines for more than a decade. And I know you're looking at photographs and you're going, he looks just so incredibly young. That's the first thing I thought when I saw this picture. He attained his master's degree in development studies from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and has held various positions in academia, in government, and in various NGOs. So we want to welcome him.
Hi, thank you very much. First of all, thank you to everyone for inviting me and for this opportunity to share our work and basically our critique of this so-called this so-called 2030 agenda for sustainable development, which, as Adam already mentioned, will be unveiled at the end of this week in New York. So and we've been tracking this process since it started about 2 years ago. So just to get ahead, if you look at how this new agenda is being hyped up, if you listen to government, if you listen to UN officials, of course they do not fall short of hype and hyperbole in describing this agenda. So you have Secretary General Ban Ki-moon describing it as a historic turning point for our world. It's a plan of action for ending poverty in all its dimensions, irreversibly, everywhere, and leaving no one behind. And it seeks to ensure peace and prosperity and forge partnerships with people and planet at the core. And that the term partnerships is a keyword. It's a buzzword, which I will try to unpack and explain later. But basically, this agenda is, of course, supposed to replace or, well, in a sense, continue the so-called unfinished agenda of the Millennium Development Goals. And if you recall, the Millennium Development Goals were unveiled 15 years ago with, of course, equally grand and noble aspirations and promises of reducing extreme poverty, of ensuring peace and prosperity, and protecting the planet. Not exactly in those words, but in those in equally very optimistic and hopeful terms. But what we have now, 15 years after this Millennium Development Goals were unveiled and this Millennium Declaration, as you all know, we're in the midst of a multiple crisis of the global capitalist system. And just, in terms of the headlines, it's not the GDP so much. It's not the conditions of the stock market as we know. It's really, if you look at the economy, it's the state of the unemployment problem remains extremely problematic. The ILO, International Labor Organization, estimates more than 200 million still unemployed, officially unemployed, and globally. And if those from those who are employed, uh, almost half of them are in so-called vulnerable forms of employment or precarious forms of employment, without contracts or only temporary contracts, or and essentially deprived or denied their basic rights, labor standards, decent work. So, and that's a growing proportion of the global the labor force, no, the global employed population. And of course, it's not just on the economic side, no. As we all know, the ecological crisis is worsening, and it's not just the climate crisis. Of course, the climate crisis is, I guess, the most dramatic expression of this crisis. But if you look at the slide in front of you, according to scientists, basically 3 out of 9 planetary boundaries have been breached. The climate crisis is the most dramatic, but the second bar there shows what the alarming levels of biodiversity loss, which scientists are comparing, or actually are describing as a sixth mass extinction in geological terms, no, comparable to the age when the dinosaurs were wiped out. And of course, that's because of loss of forests, of industrial overfishing, of land use conversion of natural habitats, and so on, that are destroying the ecological system and the basis for life of other species, of course, including people. And then, of course, the second to the last bar there, you see the nitrogen cycle, also in far beyond tipping points, and that directly relates to the kind of agriculture that we have today, which is chemical-intensive industrial farming, which is poisoning the land and the water systems with nitrogen-based fertilizers, artificial chemical fertilizers. And of course, so that's the extent of the ecological crisis, not just the climate crisis that we're confronting. Next slide, please. Of course, as we all know, not everyone is unhappy about this state of affairs. You have the top 1% of the global population controlling over 40%, and by the trends, they will soon control half of global wealth. That means half of all land, of all capital, of all of credit, of all savings, of all equipment, of all technology in the world. That's controlled by the top 1%, and the bottom 50%, that's us, are forced to share or survive on sharing the 1% of global wealth. So, and that extent of inequality is only deepening. And in fact, even in terms of, since the global financial crisis, which you would have expected that would have affected the elites, the financial oligarchs, well, in fact, since the crisis, the so-called recovery, most of it the gains from that recovery has mostly gone to the same people that caused the crisis, the financial oligarchs. And of course, in a situation where most people, and this has been true since neoliberalism has gone on a rampage, no? In a situation where most people are exploited and underpaid and unemployed, and of course the production keeps growing, production keeps improving in terms of the technological capacity, then even capitalist bosses have a problem of where to sell and how to sell their overproduced goods, and so that's why there is growing. The financial industry has been playing a growing role in terms of providing credit to the mass population. In other words, making sure that underpaid, exploited workers and people are have at least some purchasing power, which is basically based on credit. So if you look at the trends, this is the chart in front of you shows the increasing indebtedness in the U.S. Economy. Households, that's the red graph, are increasingly indebted by that extent. Other financial institutions, they're of course lending one another credit. Non-financial institutions as well, and even the government, of course, is increasingly indebted. And in fact, this is true not just for the U.S. economy, but especially for the other industrialist countries. And in the case of third world countries like the Philippines, that situation has been true for over 4 decades or even before. No, that's why you had the financial the debt crisis of the 80s and so on. Okay, so yeah, increasing indebtedness, and of course, part of that increasing financialization is not just that they're relying more on credit, on credit-driven growth or credit-driven consumption. Increasingly, they're also relying more on financial speculation. That is to say, making money from money, making money out of money, not from production, not from actual trade of actual goods and services, but in trading financial assets. And in the slide in front of you, it shows the blue graphs show the growth in the trading in financial derivatives. And of course, that really picked up since the 90s because of the deregulation of the financial industry. And that has grown far beyond the line graph in this same chart in front of you, which shows the world economic output. That is to say, the aggregate value of trade in actual goods and services. So the trading in financial paper assets has grown far beyond the extent of the real goods and services that are supposed to be underneath that, right? Because financial assets, in theory, represent future incomes from actual assets, no? from real assets in the real economy, and that has become, in other words, the financial sphere has become bloated far beyond the real conditions in the real economy. In short, that's the financial bubbles that are being created. And this is based on speculation, speculative activity. Some call it a casino economy. And of course, we've seen the devastating consequences of that. The 2008 global financial crisis, Lehman collapse, and all the big banks, sparked by the subprime mortgage crisis, is a perfect illustration of this dynamic. You know, ordinary households being led to get loans, use those loans for their consumption, for their needs, their houses, and so on. Obviously, they can't pay. Many of them can't pay because they're underpaid or unemployed, and so on, underemployed. They can't pay. The banks that loan them start failing to collect money. The banks close, and then the banks that lend to those banks close, and so on. So that you had the financial crisis of 2008, affecting not just the U.S. economy, but as far as Iceland, as South Korea, Malaysia, and so on. And now, of course, even after the bailouts of the big banks, essentially the bailouts of the big banks merely transferred that indebtedness from the banks and the private financial system to the governments, right? That's why now what we're faced with are public debt crises, sovereign debt crises, and this is most clearly seen in Europe, in the case of Greece, but other economies in Europe are also on the brink. You have Italy, you have Spain, and so on. So the financialization, which of course in a sense is an attempt of the financial oligarchy to cope with the real contradictions in the system, wherein people do not have money because they're being exploited, and their wealth is based on exploiting people and keeping the majority poor. Um, and and now we're faced with a new global financial crisis in the offing, and this is the center of this is now more in the so-called emerging markets. After 2008, many of the emerging markets were heralded as the new growth centers, because Europe was in recession, the U.S. was in recession, Japan has been in a recession for over a decade. In other words, the so-called engines of growth in the past, the centers of global capitalism, were in deep crisis. So they were looking to the emerging markets as the new growth centers. And true enough, much of the money that went to the financial system through quantitative easing were not used to create jobs in the US or in Europe and so on, but used for investing or re-lending in emerging markets. So you had financial bubbles now being created also in the emerging markets because of the loose credit that was applied through quantitative easing, for instance, in the U.S. No? So much of that money was reinvested or reloaned in so-called emerging markets. And now these financial bubbles that were created are now starting to erupt as well. No? In China, you had stock market collapse a few weeks back. Although in the case of China, because the stock market isn't that big a proportion of the globe of the Chinese economy, then it's not as bad in terms of its impact as if it happens in the U.S., for instance. But nevertheless, it's an indication of things to come, of these financial bubbles that are erupting once again. And of course, because of the globalized economy, the globalized financial system, this has knock-on effects to the rest of the global economy. Of course, side by side with the growing inequality, the growing impoverishment and exclusion and marginalization of the majority of the peoples of the world, you have the elites making sure that basically the status quo is not challenged and is not disrupted in a fundamental way. And so you have side by side with the economic and social inequities, you have growing fascization or rise, in the case of the U.S., a so-called rise of the national security state, greater surveillance, greater police brutality, greater really tight the police system, the profit-oriented prison industrial complex in the U.S., making sure that a lot of the population is cowed into or not challenging the existing laws and that protect the private property of the elites. And this, of course, this is not just happening in the U.S. The trend of increasing militarism is rampant throughout the world. You have continued increasing U.S. military presence, not just through direct troops, but through private contracted, essentially mercenary outfits. I think even in some places their presence is even greater than actual U.S. troops. And it's not just U.S. bases that are being built in different parts of the planet. It's also more military joint exercises or joint agreements, or what they call access agreements with militaries of other countries. So, for instance, in the Philippines, of course, there are no official U.S. bases now because we kicked them out. The People's Movement kicked them out in the 90s. But the U.S. still has free access, basically, to all Philippine military facilities. And they have free access to dock their ships, the aircraft carriers, even with nuclear arms, which is against our Constitution, by the way. We have free access to do that because of a military agreement between my government and the U.S. government. And these similar agreements are being inked with other countries as well. Of course, this is in the context of um, more conflicts erupting, also as a result of fundamental unjust and unequal systems, no, both national and the global. So you have in Ukraine essentially a proxy conflict between Russia and the U.S., and of course that's underlying that is control of natural gas and oil in that region. Similarly, the conflicts in Syria, Libya, Yemen, Turkey. On the one hand, supposedly it's about restoring democracy or establishing democracy against tyrannical governments, but also underneath, it's also about making sure that there's regime change, wherein the regimes that replace these autocrats are maybe new autocrats that are more favorable to U.S. imperialist interests in these areas. In North Africa and Central Africa, lots of conflicts as well there. This is more, of course, because of decades of the devastation of the productive base, the economic base in these countries, such as Somalia, wherein people basically don't have alternative livelihood opportunities and therefore resorting to piracy. And of course, resorting to armed Islamic fundamentalism as the ideological base for such resistance. Of course, we know Palestine that continues to be occupied, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. Okay, so clearly, that's the current situation where we're at globally, and I think that's a clear indictment of the failure of the so-called Millennium Development Goals and the Millennium Declaration 15 years ago, which promised to address all of these problems, no? But in effect, 15 years hence, we're in a worse situation. And so now looking back at the Millennium Development Goals and the so-called Millennium Declaration, what is clear is that these merely serve to sugarcoat or to raise hopes of people that globalization, which was at that time was still all the hype, that globalization can serve the people and the planet, and peace and prosperity for all. But now, clearly, that is clearly not the case. But now, what we have is that they're now proposing to replace these failed MDGs. Of course, they do not admit its failure, but rather that it needs to be continued because it's unfinished. So now they're going to replace it with a new set of sustainable development goals. Yeah, so now this new sustainable development goals that replace the MDGs, there are all 17 of them. So you have the first 7 in front of you. There are goals on, and of course still, on ending poverty, on ending hunger, on ensuring health, education, gender equality, water and sanitation for all, energy. There's of course, on employment, ensuring full, productive employment and decent work for all. There's about building infrastructure and ensuring industrialization and innovation. There's even a special goal there on reducing inequality within and among countries, something that was absent in the MDGs. There's about cities and urbanization, about ensuring sustainable consumption and production. That's the environmental dimension, which was also quite absent or very weak in the MDGs. There's something on climate change, on oceans, on forests, on peace, and the last slide there, which talks about strengthening the means of implementation and revitalizing the global partnership for sustainable development. That pertains to what governments as a multilateral system is willing to chalk up in terms of finance, in terms of technology, in terms of technical capacity building. So that's what they call means of implementation. So in other words, if you look at the new SDGs, there seems to be a promise for everyone's concerns. No, everyone's problems is going to be addressed by these new SDGs. And if you look at underneath each of these 17 goals, there are specific targets. All 169 of them. There are 169 targets altogether for all of these 17 goals. And of course, it's too long a list, obviously, to go through. But just to give you a flavor, if you look at under Goal 2, which is ending hunger, if you look at the slide in front of you, it talks about by 2030, end hunger and ensure access by all people, particularly the poor, on food. By 2030, end all forms of malnutrition. By 2030, double agricultural productivity. In other words, they're committing to very concrete time-bound targets for these 17 goals. No? So in that sense, it seems, well, good. We should welcome these. There's even here, for instance, on maintaining genetic diversity of seeds as one of the targets. And of course, these last 3 points here is about what international system can do about it. It's about cooperation. It's about removing trade restrictions. And of course, this group would know what that means, right? And then the proper functioning of commodity markets and their derivatives. Look, take note that it's not about regulating or limiting derivatives trading. It's simply making sure that they function properly. Now, of course, these are goals and targets. The declaration itself, the document that will be unveiled by the end of this week, does not specify how these goals and targets will be achieved. In the same way that the MDGs, they did not specify how the MDGs were supposed to be achieved. Of course, in the MDG experience, we know how they tried to achieve it, right? They implemented more liberalization, privatization, and deregulation. And that is precisely our fear or our estimation of what will happen once again with these SDGs. And one way to look at it is if you look at what the business sector is saying ought to be implemented, what policies and what measures ought to be implemented in order to achieve these goals. And the business sector is a good reference point because in the discussions on this declaration and the SDGs, the basic posture or position of governments, all governments, no, is that they don't have the money. And therefore, you need to rely on the private sector to mobilize resources that are in the hands of the private sector in order to achieve these goals. And so if that is their premise, then therefore you would expect that it's what businesses want to, what kind of measures and policies businesses want that are likely to be implemented in the name of achieving these goals. Just to take one example, Goal 2 on ending hunger. This is what the business perspective is on that. This is a briefing paper that they circulated while they were lobbying for the new goals. They're saying here businesses can take part or are taking part through development of new crops and training farmers on new technologies. Of course, we know what that means. It means more genetically modified organisms, more GM seeds that are patented by Monsanto, and making farmers even more dependent on that. And in some cases, the trend now is that use of traditional seeds by farmers are being criminalized, are being prohibited in favor of the use of these new seed technologies. They will go on to say that they will provide affordable and quality inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, farm equipment. In other words, there's a whole package of farm technologies that come along with the use of these GM seeds or these new hybrid seeds. And these farm technologies, what is happening is that, again, farmers become more dependent on these. And then lastly, if you look at the last part of that slide, they're saying that there's mutual advantage in integrating geographically and economically isolated smallholder farmers into the value chains of these global essentially agri multinationals. And we know what it means in our experience, all of these. So if the business agenda on ending hunger is to be implemented, it means greater control of these multinationals over the production and markets through the so-called market chains, or value chain, sorry. The greater dependence of these small farmers on corporate-controlled seeds and pesticides. And even in these markets, because in these so-called value chains, what happens is, for instance, in the Philippines, you have dole, tens of thousands of hectares of dole plantations here. But that's doubled by contract farming arrangements with other small farmers and peasants in surrounding areas. So these smallholder farmers are now under contract to supply pineapples to, say, Dole or Del Monte. And under that contract, it's Dole and Del Monte who sets what is to be planted, what kind of seeds to be planted, how much is to be paid, what kind of farm inputs are to be used, when they are delivered, at what rates. And in other words, everything is dictated by the buyer, by the agro corporate buyer of these in these supply contracts. So that's what these value chains look like in concrete terms. And the net effect, of course, is that it's true, yields are increasing, but because in producing these yields, farmers need to buy seeds, need to buy fertilizers, need to buy pesticides, need to buy farm equipment that are appropriate for these types of production, then their costs of production are actually increasing. So while gross incomes are, in some areas, are increasing, there is actually less incomes for farmers. And this is the story behind over 300,000 farmers who have already committed suicide in India because of bankruptcy over the last 2 decades. No? Because of the onslaught of corporatized, industrialized, and globalized agriculture. And then there's the other side to this. I've already alluded to this because governments are saying there's no money, so they will resort to tapping private finance and private investors, and they're doing this in several ways. No, one trend is that they're relying more on what they call blended finance. That is to say, they're using official development assistance, foreign aid, combining it supposedly with private investment money, private finance, so that the private investors are incentivized to go into infrastructure projects or social development projects and so on. But many of these, according to studies, are actually going to profitable areas anyway. So in effect, ODA money, which is public money, in effect becomes used as subsidy for private investment that make money and make profits for these investors. The other and increasingly more common is the use of so-called public-private partnerships. And PPPs are a new, they're not so new, but they're increasingly more popular form of privatization because it's not outright privatization, it's supposedly essentially joint ventures between the public sector and private investors. Wherein the typical case is that the private investors provide the finance, the money, and governments provide guarantees. Essentially, what those guarantees mean that the private investors, say in an energy project, a power plant, or a dam, or a road project, or a airport, the private investors are guaranteed a revenue stream. And if that revenue stream is not met, um, usually they try to meet that revenue stream by charging their users, right? So if you have road projects, the investors in that road project charge tolls for using that. And if the money that they collect from charging tolls is not enough to meet the guaranteed revenue stream that they were promised by the government then picks up the difference, puts the bill for the difference. That's essentially what these guarantees mean. And that's true for road projects, for airports, for dam projects, for power supply agreements, and so on. So in effect, again, uh, the profits are privatized, but the risks associated with these investments, which are usually large investments in infrastructure, they're guaranteed and they're borne by the public sector through these PPPs. And that's why you have now governments also increasingly more indebted because of what they call contingent liabilities from these PPPs. Not to mention that, in other words, the profits and the gains are privatized, the risks are socialized. And they're raising it to a new and higher level in recent years, because now these PPPs are being bundled as new asset classes. In other words, it's not just one road project or two, but they're bundling several road projects, for instance, into, let's say, a new asset class. They would call it, say, ASEAN connectivity bond. And these bonds will be, of course, sold in the capital markets for financial investors, including financial speculators, to invest in these bonds. In the same way that, of course, they trade these financial assets around. So, in other words, it becomes another fodder for more financial trading and financial speculation in the financial market. So all of these is what they're doing, or what they are likely to be doing in the name of implementing these or achieving these sustainable development goals. So in other words, it's not enough. It's not enough for us to actually examine the document that they will be unveiling next week, the so-called Sustainable Development Goals. If you go through them, they actually all look good. What is important is to examine them in the context of broader trends of policies and measures that governments are actually doing on the ground, not what they're promising in these August halls of the UN. We mentioned privatization, deregulation. Next slide. And this links up to what this group is most involved in, at least based on the conversation I heard this morning. If you look at the SDGs, and what's important to note is the SDGs are non-binding. No, like the MDGs, they're non-binding. They do not have consequences for governments if they do not achieve these goals. No, there is no penalties, no enforcement mechanism for these. These are just promises. On the other hand, these same governments that are making these promises in the form of SDGs are also, at least the most powerful among them, are also the ones involved in negotiating these new free trade agreements, no? As you're all familiar with. So it's not just TPP, it's TISA, it's TTIP, it's the economic partnership agreements with the EU, and so on. The so-called 21st century trade agreements. And of course, as we all know in this group, it's essentially about erecting new rules, global rules, that strengthen global corporate power. And in fact, in many ways, veto power over government regulations, more privatization. There's, of course, strengthening IPR and so on, locking in trade liberalization. You know about all these, I'm sure, the lock-in provisions in some of these agreements. So, um, uh, um, so in effect, if we sum up this emerging post 2015 agenda, essentially the best that we can say about it is that it's an expanded and revamped MDGs. It takes up issues that were absent in the MDGs. And unfortunately, many people are welcoming it. Many CSOs and NGOs are welcoming it for that reason. But and what we've been trying in the campaign for People's Goals is to really expose what are the likely implications of this by examining these promises in the context, or contrasting this in the context of what governments are actually doing on the ground, as well as what they're actually committing to in other fora, and in particular these FTAs, which are binding. We know are binding, which we know have consequences. These agreements will be ratified by governments. These will be ratified and translated to national legislation and laws and have national enforcement. So this is the real binding agenda. That's the real emerging development agenda. What they're doing outside of what they're promising in the UN. So in effect, the SDGs, because they will be hyped up and they will be promoted very aggressively through the public relations machinery of the UN and the UN system and the donor agencies, then they will serve, like the MDGs, to serve as sugarcoating, as false promises, as false hopes for the people, and in effect serving to legitimize and revive capitalist growth model, capitalist neoliberalism, and a legitimization for more imperialist globalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.